Hello, everyone. I think I'm live. I think this is actually working. Hi, and welcome to ArtCamp 3 Week 1 Critique, the 2018 edition. Oh, hey, it actually is working. Just a slight delay on it. Cool. So we're going to critique some of your value studies you did this week. You guys did fantastic, as expected. Very good work. These studies are really important, and you learn a lot more than you think you realize you're learning when you do them. They're incredibly useful. If you can nail the concepts that are going on here, the rest of the course becomes way easier. Landscapes are really built on these fundamental skills that you learn in this stuff. So it actually won't take too long to go through all of the pieces, even though we've got, I believe, 27 different submissions for this week. It actually won't take terribly long because I'm not going to get really involved with doing long paint overs today. There's just not that much use in doing that. Most of the concepts are pretty high level, and that's kind of what I want to stick to. I'll pick out a few things that I'm seeing in the pieces and some things to think about for the next time. But then I actually want to do a short demo after we do this that I think is fairly useful for the stuff we were talking about this week, as well as for the upcoming weeks. And I think it'll kind of help you guys figure out some stuff. So I'm going to share my screen here. And let's do that. Whoa, let me get the weird, trippy thing going on. So I will watch the chat today if you guys have questions and all that. I'll do my best to answer any questions you have and keep updated on that. And other than that, I'm just going to go through these pieces and point out a few things here and there. So let's just start here. These are looking good. You've got some good stuff going on here. My initial read is that you're missing out on a little bit of the value range, both on the light end and on the dark end. You're missing a little bit of some contrast you could have here. I think things could get pushed a little bit lighter and a little bit darker to help things read. Something as simple as, say, just darkening up, say, a portion of this would help something like this read a little bit better. Just as simple as that. Just kind of looking at some of your value relationships and making sure you've got enough contrast going on to let everything work well. Your imaginary ones are looking good. You're definitely picking up some of the things that you were studying in the referenced ones. I'd say one of the things to think about as you're doing some of your imaginary stuff is figuring out the horizon line a little bit better. Your perspective is getting a little bit wonky, and just something to keep in mind as you're going forward, because the perspective stays pretty solid when you're doing the reference things, but you're not quite as clear on things when you start moving into the imaginary stuff, if that makes sense. But these look good. Let's see here. Right, these look cool. My first reaction is trying to think how to put all this stuff into words. These look good. Trying to figure out exactly what is the issue here. I think the thing is you're getting in too many, shall we say, details at this level, and they're causing you to get a little bit off on your values and causing you to muddy up your landscapes a little bit. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with anything you're doing here. Actually, I think your values are pretty good for the most part. I just think you're adding in a little bit too much contrast and texture where you don't need it. And by that I mean, if you were to take one of these and simplify it a bit, I think you'd have much stronger positions here. I think you've got just a bit too much going on here, and this is This is something we'll kind of realize as we do more and more finished work during the course, is that often what your piece needs is not necessarily more detail. Often what it needs is stronger fundamentals. So if you were to take out some of these contrasting values that I think are throwing this piece off, I think you'd have a bit stronger thumbnail. Actually just removing your detail. I find that I do that a lot when I do paint overs, is take out things rather than add things in. I think there's often more to be gained from doing that. Most of the time, artists struggle by adding too many things to their pieces when they should really focus on taking a few things out. Just a quick example there of just removing some of that detail. And I think if you were to do that on the rest of these, you would have a lot stronger ones. Same goes for carrying it over into your imaginary ones. I feel like you're, again, getting a little bit too much into detail at this stage and need to focus a bit more on making sure that you've got those shapes right before you get too far into that. Try to have as many, I guess, crisp edges as you can. It's often tempting to use texture or other effects to make something interesting, but most of the interest you need to have in your pieces needs to come from very simple shapes, very simple silhouettes. And then once you've got that, you can always do fancy stuff with that. But try to focus on a little bit clearer shapes. All right, these look sweet. So I'm guessing the top are the reference and the bottom are the imaginary. These are looking good. Yeah, I like these. I think, again, you could probably use I think there's a few areas where you're not really utilizing the full value range, where you're ending up in just sort of a middling value range, and could go a little bit darker and get that darker value contrast going on. For the imaginary stuff, it does look like your perspective's getting a little bit wonky, and you're not paying quite enough attention sometimes to those value relationships. But I do like them. They are looking good. I particularly like this one in the middle here and this one down in here in the corner. I think those are pretty successful and working well. Yeah, overall it looks good. Looks like you're getting the point of it and getting some stuff out of it. Yeah, I don't really know that I have too much to add to that. Yeah, it looks good. To answer the question with vanishing points, yeah, we are going to talk more about perspective. Perspective I'm going to harp on for basically this entire class. Perspective is something people screw up on all the time, but it is something we cover during this. So don't worry if you're a little daunted by perspective at the time being. We'll get there and we'll figure it out. Let's see here. These are looking good. I'd say right now you're a little bit too soft with things. Right now you're not quite as clear and crisp as I'd like to see these. I don't know whether that means work a little bit bigger, work a little bit slower, work a little bit more zoomed in. I'm not sure what it is, but I think at this stage in the painting, it's valuable to have some clarity in there, so that you kind of have to make the decisions. It's a bit harder and will often look a little bit worse for a while than having the nice softness and implied brushstrokes and all of this other fun stuff that we're doing. But I swear it is more useful down the road if you force yourself to make very, very clear decisions of very clear shapes. The softness can always come later, but trying to use brush textures and stuff like this right now is a bit of a dangerous road to go down. because it encourages people to rely on those things a bit too much. Again, just trying to like simplify a few of the things, clarify some of the shapes. All right, so just a little something like that. So not too much different, but I think it's enough of an aid that I think you'll find a little bit more benefit if you do encourage yourself to force yourself to do this stuff. So it's just a little bit of a difference, but being very, very clear with this stage of things will help you make better decisions down the road. So I'm seeing it kind of coming down into your imaginative stuff, where the shapes aren't quite as definite and clear and defined. And so you're trying to imply large things with these big brush strokes and stuff, and not making super obvious decisions. So even when you're doing the reference stuff, make these really obvious decisions of shapes and make those as clear and realized as possible, so that so you have an easier time when you do get into the imaginative stuff. A little bit sharper on the edges and shapes. Right, these look good. Let's see here. Always take me a little bit of thinking before I start rambling on. I particularly like some of these a little stronger than others. Like I consider this very strong. This one's pretty close to being strong, and yeah, so they're getting there. I think. Oh, and I also really like this imaginative one down here in the corner. That's quite good. So you're doing a lot of good things. You've got a lot of good values going on. I think part of the thing is you're not getting enough depth in some of these as far as the values go. So part of what we're trying to do is structure the image so that you both have an interesting composition and so that you get clear read of the distance. And actually, I'm thinking maybe some of that is to do with the drawing. So I think if you came in here and fixed up some of the shapes to improve that perspective, I think you'd have a bit of a stronger thumbnail here. So even though these are fairly fast studies, it is important to spend your time in the places that really pay off, which is typically where things overlap with other things and where you've got the silhouettes reading. That's where you spend a little bit of extra time drawing and just slight amounts of tweaks and turn a piece that actually has fairly good values into one that has much, much better values. The other thing I think I'm seeing with some of these is thinking a little bit more about what sort of value range you want to have for the piece. Right now, you're a little bit similar on all of them. They all have sort of similar balances of light and dark. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about during the demo after we go through these pieces, is that you can have different value ranges for the same pieces. There's different solutions to the same problems. I'll explain a little bit more about what I'm talking about later, but I think, for instance, you could take something like this that is one solution to it, and you could, for instance, brighten it. You can darken it. You can do some different things here that could make different things pop. So, for instance, for this one, I might be tempted to do a little bit more contrast to help it get the sunny look to it. Because for instance, I know this reference photo because I took it. I think this is a case where it was a very sunny scene. And so I think, I don't know why that's not working. All right, cool. Where you could push the contrast a bit to help imply that. So just by very quickly scribbling a little bit on top and adding in this darker value here, maybe even pushing that back into it a little bit, you start to get a stronger sense of really, really bright sunlight rather than something that's a bit more muted. It almost feels kind of, I don't know, almost a little bit nighttime there. One thing I see pretty often with what people do is they pick a value range and they kind of end up with this look of back when they used to shoot movies during the daytime and then would just shift the values and colors to make them look like it's nighttime. And you get this sort of surreal look to things that's not quite right. It's a little bit too dark or a little bit too muted or just not quite what you'd expect to see at night. And so you get some very strange effects. And I see people doing that with their paintings and with their values, where they will key their paintings a little bit too dark or muted and end up with something that looks a little bit odd. So just something to think about for the future. But he's looking good. Right, these look good. My first initial impression is you're a little too contrasty, too all over the place. A little bit too disjointed with your values. These could all benefit from more simplification and a little less contrast in places. Some of these are a little more successful than others. This one is kind of getting where you want to be with these studies. Same goes for this one. Very simple, but is an effective solution. So for something like this, I would try my best to, first of all, break this up into very simple values. So what happens if we just take all that, tie that down, make the sky a little bit simpler here. I promise you we will get into plenty of painting with plenty of rendering and all the fun stuff and textures and details and all that stuff. But unless a landscape is built on these super simple fundamentals, they tend to end up not so great looking. They don't read very well. They don't function as well as a landscape, and are a little distracted from what they're really all about. Still have these brights. Still have this river. But we've taken things and we've really dumbed them down, so to say. We've taken out all the contrast and detail. Because you're allowed to have that contrast and detail, it just needs to be in a very tight value range. And we're inclined to add too much contrast in too many places, but it doesn't make for the most effective image. It tends to make for images that we as people really struggle to read and understand. It ends up sort of this cacophony effect where we don't quite understand the image. It makes it for a less visually appealing image. So I would encourage you to try to simplify, really dumb down what you're doing and break it into very clear shapes so that we can see what's going on. Because before, if you just kind of squint at that, you can't really read it. Right now, it's kind of just a dark with some lines through it and a bright dot, and you can't even really pick out the figure there because it's so muddied in values. So I would just pick things out and clear it up a bit, kind of like what you're doing with this one here in the middle. Your Your imaginative stuff is a bit clearer. It is a little bit easier to read. I would just encourage you to try to see some more of that in the studies you're doing. Try to learn to interpret the reference so that you can end up doing stuff a little bit closer to actually what you're doing in the imaginative stuff. Try to interpret the reference so that you can come up with something nice and readable. It definitely will require some interpretation. Let me just take a look at the chat. Yeah, making sure nobody has any questions or anything like that. And yes, this will be recorded and you can watch it anytime. See you guys know. Right, these look good. They're looking solid. First impression is you're also a little too hesitant with some of your values. They're getting a little too tight in value range, and you're not letting yourself have enough contrast in places. For your imaginative ones, I'm struggling to read exactly what's going on, which is fine at a certain stage. It's fine to have some ambiguity that you figure out later, but I would encourage you to push them a little bit further and have a little bit more indication of kind of what exactly is going on. Make some confident decisions about what things are, where the horizon line is, and let us know like exactly what you're trying to paint here. Because there's a lot of ways that I could read this sketch here, but if you come in here and just spend a few more minutes and make some confident decisions of, all right, well, these are going to be rocks here, so I'm going to paint them like I paint rocks. And then I'm going to have a sky back here, and I'm going to do my little perspective thing and have some perspective cloud stuff going on, and just be a little bit more confident with your decision making as you're doing this imaginative stuff, because you're doing some nice stuff in the referenced work. I like how you've broken down the shapes. I like some of the simplification you've made of the forms, some of the more straight lines you've put in there. I really like seeing that stuff. It's good. It works well, and I'd like to see you keep doing that. So yeah, just a little bit more contrast in places, a little bit less wary of some of the brighter values. You're allowed to get pretty bright, especially with the skies. This is kind of on point with what skies typically are. They're typically very bright, much more so than people think. When you think about that's not even white there. You've got a fair bit more of your value range that you can probably put in there. All right, these look good. I would tell you first of all to avoid painting too much. You're painting a little too much, and because of that, I think you're missing out on some of the values. You're too focused on what you're painting that you're missing out on some of the value stuff. Like you painted this water, for instance, like you think water looks, but if you start looking at the values here, you start to notice they're pretty dark values. They're certainly mid-tone at best. And because you were a little too focused on what you were painting, you missed out a little bit on those values. Actually, not too many bright values down in here. The values are pretty muted. And because of that, you'll actually get a better look of water if you pay attention to those values. Water's a weird one where the values of it are often a bit darker than people think. They keep painting these, bright white rivers and stuff when, in fact, they're very, very rarely bright white. They're often kind of muddy and dirty and reflecting something dark. And even when they're reflecting lights, they're still darker than what you're seeing. So I would pay a little bit more attention and a little less attention to what you're painting, so to speak. I don't mean like quite like that, but focus a little bit more on the shapes and less on what you think it is. So for instance, when you're painting these snowy spots here on the mountain, think of it less as painting snow up there and more as, okay, I'm going to abstract this shape here into something that I can simplify into a larger mass rather than trying to paint kind of textured things and stuff. I'm going to look at the patterning here and think about, okay, how can I really simplify this into a clear shape? And this is the stuff we try to hold on to when we go to finishing pieces. It's so easy to lose track of this stuff when you're actually doing full paintings, that I try to drill it home as much as possible during this stage, so that when we do get on to finishing stuff, I will just harp on you guys to remember all of the stuff we're doing right now. Because maintaining these shapes that we're trying to study now is incredibly important for where we're going. Now, as far as your imaginative stuff goes, there's sort of this sense of you're really simplifying down a lot of the shape and value and lighting relationships here. Like, I'm not getting a strong sense of form and lighting in what you're doing here. You're breaking things down pretty decently into, you know, layers, and part of it is coming down to the fact that you're backlighting, I guess, all of these, and so they do tend to simplify a bit when you do that. But you're losing out on a fair bit of the form and the dimensionality of these mountains. You know, start to think of them as dimensional perspective things rather than just flat shapes, because you're studying it pretty well in the photographs and it's not quite moving into the imaginative stuff. So, yeah. But overall, it's looking good, and I think you're getting some value out of it. So, yeah. That's good. All right, these look sweet. Really like what you did in this one here. This one like immediately pops out and reads, and you can see this is a good kind of example of, you didn't paint anything. Nothing here is painted, but the values and shapes are very good. So you know exactly what it is. But if you actually look at it, it's all like scribbly blobs and stuff. So this is a good example of, if you can get the forms and shapes and values just right, it kind of doesn't matter that much how you paint it, at least at this stage. When you're finishing a painting, yeah, I'm going to tell you to render things like crazy, because you should. But for now, it's all about shapes and values. So these are very good. You're doing great with analyzing all of the shapes, analyzing all the values. They're working quite well. Yeah, these look good. You're getting a little too contrasty in places where I think you could benefit from some softness, and you're letting some stray brush strokes detract a bit from some of your things here. So I would encourage you to maybe tone down some of the contrast in places, even if it looks like it is that value or something. Some things are just a little too contrasty. Like, this feels a little too far away to really be these super dark values. I would consolidate those values just up here in the front, just for the sake of a little bit of atmospheric perspective going on. It's a bit of a nitpicky thing, but those are sort of small decisions you can make that will take a good thumbnail like this and push it a little bit further. Yeah, these are really good. Excuse me. When you're going into these are looking good. First impression I've got is you immediately lose the sense of perspective when you're going into these. I have a much weaker sense of how the perspective is working. And I don't know whether the solution there would be to lay a stronger perspective grid down or what, but I would definitely try to focus a little more on that as you're getting into that. This one's getting kind of close to being able to read the perspective, but even that, I think you could emphasize a bit more with like the distant ground plane here, as well as maybe pushing up some of the up close stuff so we get a stronger sense of perspective. Because some of the strengths of what you're doing in the reference stuff is the perspective. Like this thing has very strong sense of perspective, whereas when you're doing sort of something based on that, you're missing out on that feeling of dimensionality. You're kind of flattening things out. So you're getting the lighting and values, but you're not picking up on the almost the drawing stage of what you've studied, if that makes sense. So try to get that perspective in there as much as possible as you're doing these, you're doing your imaginative stuff. Really try to draw in there to get that horizon line strong. Overall, looking really, really good. I like what you've done here. Yeah, you're definitely on the right path. I would just push drawing a little bit more when you're doing these, and then think a little bit more about where you're placing your really strong darks when you're doing your reference stuff, because you're a little bit too liberal with where you're placing those. You've got them a bit too much. You got to use them really carefully. Very selectively, as selectively as you would when you're using your extreme brights, which you're actually doing a fairly good job of. So this one, for instance, you've got really strong brights over here on the right, and you've managed to have brights in the rest of the piece, but they've all been much more muted than right there. And that's great. So try to think of the same thing when you're applying the extreme dark values to a piece, where you want to concentrate them to focus the eye and to focus the attention. All right, more of these. Let's see here. These look good. Yeah, I like these. Let's see here. Overall, very good. I like the kind of switch up you did here with the values. That's super cool. I like this really bright foreground mixed with these darker backgrounds. I might, in a case like this, just to emphasize that this is solid material, to actually brighten the sky a little bit. Skies, as I know I've explained, and I know I will continue to explain forever, skies are quite bright. And so if you push your values a little brighter here, it's gonna show us that this is a little bit darker than the sky, and make it a little bit easier for us to read this thumbnail as, oh, that's the ground and that's, you know, the background there. But overall, I think this is a really nice one. And most of them are working pretty well. This forest one is a little bit confusing here, partially because forests are confusing, and that's actually kind of what the demo is that I'm going to be doing later. It'll kind of show some of the problems with doing those. I think when you get into your imaginative stuff, though, is when you run into a little bit of problem with relying on, shall we say, old habits to try to paint rather than designing good thumbnails. That is, you're starting to think about more how I'm going to paint something and less about how am I going to make this an interesting composition. And so by that, I mean, rather than focusing on the shapes here, you're focusing on, all right, I'm painting grass, I'm painting trees, I'm painting clouds. And I think at this stage, it would be best if you're thinking more, okay, so I want the shapes of the clouds to be doing this. And I want, you know, maybe some of these pillars to be overlapping those. shapes. And so thinking more in shapes and less in painting, shall we say. Less in, all right, here's, I'm going to do, a normal landscape because I know how to do a normal landscape. Your shapes, taking out all your detail. Again, that's what I seem to do when I do paint overs, is they take out detail. All this little detail is less important right now. Yes, more shapes, less subject matter. That is very true. That is exactly what I'm trying to get at. Worry a little bit less about what you're painting, and more about, okay, I'm going to make super awesome shapes. Like obviously, you can get to a point where you've just got abstract blobs, and we are trying to paint landscapes here, and so you should probably have some indication of what on earth is going on. But if the shapes don't work, your piece is just not going to work. Whereas if the shapes are strong and solid and awesome, you could probably figure out a few different things to paint with those same shapes, and they would be equally successful. So, just a little thing to think about there. But overall, very successful. I like what you're doing here. And yeah, getting the right idea. All right. So these have some good values. I think the problem here is just you're not making strong decisions. Everything is way too soft, and you need to really buckle down and make super strong decisions. So rather than trying to paint a black and white landscape, try to use only an incredibly hard, no softness, no texture, nothing firm brush, and paint the exact same things you're trying to paint here, and show us your really obvious decision making. All these values that are sort of in the mid-tone or dark range, decide whether they're, okay, are they going to be dark? Are they going to be mid-tone? Are they going to be light? Show us exactly what value you want those to be. Because obviously when you finish a painting, you can have an infinite modulation of values. But for this stage of the thumbnailing, I want you to be extremely painfully clear about what you're doing. Make it really obvious, make it really sharp, really clear. And I swear there is tons and tons of value to doing this. It is super, super important. I know it can be really annoying and it can look worse. The simple fact is that most of the time when you do one of these, yes, it will look less cool than when you're doing, cool texture effects and lighting effects, and you're not going to be able to get things glow and have nice gradients and all of this wonderful stuff. But that's not really the point of what we're doing here. What the point is breaking things down into really good shapes. I swear it is helpful. I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and the difference between good and bad landscape paintings often comes down to this first stage of, all right, are the shapes good? Are the shapes not good? And what can I do to make the shapes stronger? Just kind of eliminating all your detail, all your nice effects here. And in some ways, yes, I have made it look uglier. I've actually taken out a lot of the cool stuff you were doing. But that's not the point of what we're doing. And what we're doing here is making good decisions. And yes, please ask questions. I'll do my best to look at the chat. If I somehow miss your question, please just repeat it again and again and again. And eventually I'll see it. You can just yell at me in all caps and I'll probably definitely see it. Please don't yell at me. Yeah, make stronger decisions. Use only a hard brush. You are officially banned from using any soft brushes at all for at least a few weeks. You have to use hard brushes and hard brushes only, because not because it looks better, because it probably will look worse, and that's fine. But the thing is you need to make clearer decisions, and it's better to go too sharp and too clear with all your edges than to go too mushy. It's much easier to go the other way around, especially for practice. It's better to put down the right value, the right shape, rather than kind of messing around with different shapes, different values. So, how do you find good shapes? Do you look for reference with good shapes? Do you actually do trial and error till something workable comes out? It's a good question. Part of it does come from doing the reference stuff. Looking at nature is one of the best ways to find shapes. It's one of the best ways to find interesting, cool shapes. Most of us, when we start painting, don't have a very obvious idea of what nature looks like, of what cool shapes look like. And so we end up just kind of doing what is in our head, which is not very cool. So looking at reference, doing a lot of studies of reference helps a ton. Same goes for drawing from life. You'll have a much better idea of how to paint all sorts of things the more you paint them. So that's probably the best way. The other thing to do is, as we're going to do in this coming week, doing master studies. Masters have figured out a lot of cool interpretations of nature. And the fact is that they've done a great job with it, and you kind of get to steal some of their hard work and use some of those awesome shapes in your own work. Excuse me. I have trouble getting into the details. I get stuck. Are the details always found in reference? I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Are the details always found in reference? And whether you're struggling with getting into details, as in you're struggling because you always do details, or you're struggling because you can't do details. If you could clarify that for me, that'd be great. These look good. These look really good. Yeah, I like these a lot. I'd say that when you went to do your imaginative stuff, you got a little too conservative, because you learned all these cool value things here in your reference stuff, and then you seem to have gotten a little scared off from doing other stuff with your values when you got into these. For instance, you were a little too scared to go bright or interesting with your skies, so you end up with sort of the similar mid-tone-ish bright sky. And then you kind of go a little bit conservative again with having these sort of swooping foregrounds that are kind of repeated in most of these. A little bit too intimidated to be more bold with what you're doing in your reference stuff. So for instance, if you take this one, you take a look at this one, it's got some very cool stuff going on. It's got an interesting sky. It's even got some bright values in this dark foreground that work quite well. And if you take something like this, you've just sort of done kind of dark midtone and then sort of a light midtone. And that's kind of where you've left it. And you haven't gone in and added some of those little bolder, a little crazier value structures and shapes when you're doing your imaginative stuff. So I would say to get a little bit more inspired almost by what you're doing here in terms of bringing your values down into these. So, whether that's as simple as, all right, well, I had waterfalls there, and waterfalls are pretty cool. So maybe I'll, add some waterfalls in this one too, because I did a study of that. So may as well steal that. And maybe, I saw, it was kind of dark and then mid-tone. Maybe I'll have a little bit more dark here. Not exactly sure what it is, but whatever you kind of want to do to be a little less intimidated by adding in some of those more interesting value arrangements, interesting shapes. Go a little bit less conservative with what you're doing. Sky's a little bit more interesting. You know, add some of those bright flares in the skies that you were getting in your reference stuff. Add some clouds to silhouette things. You know, whatever it is. Really, really pay attention as you're doing those studies so that you can bring that stuff into your own imaginative stuff. Let's see here. Oh, clarification on that question before. So it's when you go into details, you struggle. You know, a lot of the class is how to finish paintings. In fact, the last 3 weeks, all we do is finish paintings. And as we get more and more into the different weeks, you're going to get to do more and more finishing. Even part of this week, I believe we do at least one finished master study. So you get to do a little bit more of how to take something to finish. But I would say that most people do not, in fact, struggle with finishing their pieces. Most of the struggle that people have is getting these good fundamentals. There are a few people that do struggle with finishing, and it's certainly a problem, and it certainly holds people back from going further with their work. But it's very often that the problems lie during these fundamental steps. Yes, we're going to finish one painting each week for the last 3 weeks. I actually I think I did it last time, and I'll probably do it again. I'll probably stretch those weeks out to be more like 2 weeks each, as in you'll do one painting every 2 weeks, just because people usually find it a little easier and works a little bit better. All right, these look really good. These are almost perfect. They're very close to being very, very good. But they're just missing a little bit. And I think your main problem is your skies are all too contrasty in the sky. This is about the only one that I think you can get away with that. For the most part, though, I'd say that your skies are just overall just too contrasty. If you simplified all your skies and just made them like one value, all of your thumbnails here would be way stronger. You're doing about the right amount of contrast on the ground, but all of these guys are super, super contrasty. And that's where I think you're getting yourself into trouble. And it's carrying over into your imaginative stuff where you're having too much contrast in the sky and it's distracting from the ground. I think that's the real problem. But your shapes and your analysis of the forms and stuff is very good. I like what I'm seeing in all these. They're very cool. Yeah, very nice. Just try to simplify the skies. And then there's a few places where I think you're a little more successful with breaking down the values than others. Like for instance, this one over here on the left is very strong because you did simplify a lot. Whereas I think with the shadows in this one, in the bottom middle, you're a little too all over the place and broke it up into too many small shapes. And I'd like to see just trying to lose some of that interior contrast so that we can read the overall shape a little bit better. Whether that means taking out details or adding them in or reducing some of the contrast in places. I think that's what this needs is some of your interior contrasts are just too high and it's breaking up the forms that you're actually seeing quite well. But overall, very nice. Really like these. Those are nice. Oh wow, we have guidelines. Cool. Didn't even know you could have guidelines in a JPEG. That's cool. All right, these are way too low contrast. They look good. You're basically doing it right. You're just too low contrast. You're all way too faded. And if you brought the contrast of basically all of these a little higher, you'd be much closer to what you want to be doing. if you just do that, yeah, that's about right. And then once you do that, you see that the skies are a bit dark. And if you brighten up all your skies, and here's a hint, the water is almost always darker than the sky. Almost always, not always. I know you're going to show me an example of, oh my God, but it's brighter here. I know it is, but in general, it's brighter. And yeah, so your main thing you've got going on is you just haven't been using enough of the value range, and that's kind of what's holding you back. When you get into your imaginative stuff, really figure out the perspective of things. Right now, you've got a few tricky ones where it seems like the horizon line is below the image, and that can be really tricky to do. Like you've got like a sky-centric piece here that isn't quite reading because I'm not sure where things are. And then you've got a lot of pieces that the perspective is a little bit too weak on. And so even when you're in this early stage of the piece, you should still have time to get a clear sense of perspective, basically. Yeah. But overall, looking good. Just a little bit more contrast in places and a little more focus on perspective. But I will say that I really like this one down here. I really like what you've done here in the foreground with these like really dark rocks and nice tight value range there, coupled against this nice distant background with, again, very tight values. This is super cool to see. This would be a very successful sort of value range for a finished piece. Right. You, on the other hand, are often getting a little too contrasty. These things are a bit too broken up that it's causing the forms to not seem like they're held together, shall we say. So what I mean by that is if you were to take this foreground and actually bring the values a little closer together, that much closer together, all of a sudden this rock feels more like a rock and less like dark shapes and light shapes. It feels like it holds together a little bit more. And this is something people often get mixed up on, is they want contrast because they think contrast is good. And so they end up putting contrast within a single form, but it ends up breaking things up a lot. So I would actually bring some of your values a little closer together within forms. So for instance, these big rock things, cliff things, I think could be just kind of unified and turned into a more solid shape. And same goes for like waves. Don't worry about painting waves, worry about painting shapes. So think about, all right, I'm just going to paint some value here, and I don't know how to paint waves because we haven't learned how to paint waves and I haven't gotten reference for it. So just paint the shape. And you can still get a sense of light even if you have a very tight value range. Even if you had this much value range, you still get a sense of form and lighting and all that stuff. And you can even go a little bit brighter in places. You can have some spotlight effects and stuff and get that stronger sense of lighting in the landscape without kind of losing the sense of the overall image. So yeah, looking good. Yeah, you're on the right track. Just bring some of your values a little closer together, and yeah, focus on those bigger shapes. All right, these are looking good. Yeah, these look quite good. Good sense of distance. I really like what you're doing with all the atmospheric perspective in these. You're missing out on a little bit of that when you do your no referenced ones. Yeah, they're often missing a bit of the strength. Like for instance, when you painted the lake here with the mountains above it, you got this really nice value relationship that works great. And then when you painted one without reference, you made the lake like super bright, and it suddenly stopped working quite as well. And so if we just kind of lighten that up a little, or darken that just a touch, and use those really tight values to show that distant landscape, it's going to work a lot better. I like how you've consolidated your values there and really paid attention to the fact that the whole image is super dark and you've only got a little bit of light. A lot of people are really scared to do stuff like that, so it's good to see. I really like this one. Perspective on these trees is super cool. The fact that you were able to get all that perspective with such a simple composition, it's really cool to see. So I like that a lot. So yeah, overall quite good. It does feel like as you get into the imaginative stuff, focus a bit more on perspective. They're getting a little loose on the perspective, and it's causing it not to hold together quite as well. Also, all of your water, anytime you paint it in imaginative stuff, is too light, as pretty much everyone's is. Lakes are not usually that bright, so darken that stuff down. Darker than the sky. Generally darker than the sky. Make those skies nice and bright, make the water a lot darker than you think it should be. And it'll hold together better. It'll make the ground feel like ground. It'll make the air feel like air. And yes, to answer your question, I certainly get a kick out of seeing the same reference photos all the time, because I obviously took them all and I recognize them all. But it's kind of cool to see. I wouldn't do it if it actually bothered me, but I more get a kick out of it because then it kind of brings me back to when I was at those places. So it's kind of cool to see. All right, these look good. Yes. I think you're trying to do a bit too much. You're trying to paint too much, and could benefit with a bit more simplifying at this stage of things. I would say to stop using textured brushes for a little while, because they're doing two things to you. They are throwing off your edges and causing you to have sort of undefined loose edges. And they're also causing you to have a bit too much variance where your values are or should be very close together. So what I mean by that is you've got all this texture where I think you should just have simple values. They're causing you to have too much contrast where you don't really need it. Particularly relevant like here, where, yeah, you're probably going to have two values in this rock here, but you should only have two values rather than like 9 values, which is kind of what you have now. So break things down a little bit more, and texture is one of those things that's great, but it's another thing that is often used as a crutch to hide kind of haphazard thumbnails and haphazard values. I see it a lot with people that don't have, for instance, the strongest one, but they have this, flashy painting technique, and so they try to get away with doing a little bit less of this fundamental work. But it's very obvious to see when somebody does that. Whereas what we're trying to do here is break things down into those fundamentals and focus so much on them. Because once you've got those down, of course, you can always go back in and use a flashy painting technique. There's nothing wrong with that. It's more that we want to make sure that we've got these fundamentals nailed, and it's pretty easy to distract people from those things if if you've got all these nice textures and stuff. Try to simplify things a little bit. I will say that this one in particular is really, really successful. You did a good job observing all the values, and it works quite well. But you're missing out on the kind of final stage of this by not having enough clarity in your silhouettes. And so I would go back into something like this and really make sure that all of your overlaps and edges and stuff like that are very obvious, that you take the time to draw in these definite edges of forms so that the silhouettes are really clear. We know exactly where you're going to end up painting that edge, because this is something that trips people up when they get into finishing a piece, is they've done this loose sort of painterly sketch, and so when they come to finish the piece, they don't know where to make those decisions because they don't have any clear edges and they didn't make any clear decisions. And it looks nice in a sketch, but it is just a nightmare to get into if you can't make those decisions when you get into a final. So that's something I would encourage you to do. A lot of those lessons sort of apply when you've moved into your imaginative stuff as well. You're not making as many clear, obvious decisions as I'd like to see. Overall, they're looking good. They're missing out on a little bit of the interesting shape languages and compositions you're getting from some of these. Same goes for perspective. None of them have a super strong sense of perspective. Whereas if you look at the stuff you're doing from reference, you can even see something like this has a very strong sense of perspective, even though there's not a lot of things that you think would indicate that to us. But the fact that these rocks are wrapping around like they do means that we have a super obvious sense of, like, we're on this ground plane and we're looking up at this stuff. And that sense of form, even though it's very simple, it's very simply applied, does a lot to help us see that. So when you're painting a rock like this, you're not making it really obvious to me that we do have this sense of perspective and the sense of form. So that's a little something to think about as you're working on more of these. Question, do you have any advice for how values work in a nighttime scene? In daytime, the most distant things are lightest, but at nighttime, is that also true? Well, it's not always necessarily true that the most distant things are lightest. They actually tend to go towards midtones. So it's not always true. And of course, if you have, say, snow in your foreground and then your entire background is in shadow, guess what? The sunny snow in the foreground is going to be super bright. So it's not always true for that, for instance. Secondly, for nighttime, it is odd how it looks. You got to realize it kind of works in some ways the exact same, and in other ways is much more muted. And it's really a case of lots of interpretation. People have way different ideas of what they think nighttime should look like. And if you look up some of the kind of nocturne painters, it's interesting to see the different ways that they interpret them. So Remington has a certain way that he interprets moonlight as this sort of neon green, sickly yellow light, which is super pretty and works for him, but is not necessarily the way you want to paint it. So that's a case where it's very open to interpretation. Just making sure I got all the chat covered for now. That's good. All right, look at this. Somebody actually did their studies traditionally. So all the other people in the class can stop complaining because this person worked harder than you. Doing them in traditional is really, really hard. Having done the one in traditional, and I'm hoping to do a couple others just to show how it's done and make sure I can do it. They are a royal pain. So bravo to Kate here for actually doing them all traditionally. I am particularly fond of this one. This one came out really nicely. You did a wonderful job of getting that atmospheric perspective. especially in oils where you've got this nice gentle gradient of different layers going on and nice tight value ranges between these things that help it all to read. So particularly like that one, but overall, I'd say they're very successful. One thing I might suggest that I think would make your life a little easier is it seems like you did most of these in one pass, as in you did them alla prima, and I might suggest you do them in 2 passes, just because there are some things about painting landscapes that alla prima makes tremendously difficult, that it looks like you ran into, and that is when you start adding, for instance, clouds on top of your background, you get this weird sort of mixing effect, and it doesn't quite work. It gets some weird contrast in there, and it's very obvious you have to cake on the paint to do it, and you end up with a lot of sort of scattered edges and stuff. So I would come back in here and try to clarify your edges a little bit more. This one I think works because you do have some fairly obvious edges, and I think that's part of what is helping this one out. So a little bit, maybe another pass on getting in those edges would be good. Traditional is a pain, obviously, but that's the way it goes. The other thing I would say is your reference pieces have a much stronger sense of perspective for the most part than your non-referenced ones do. For instance, you can see just between these, wait, these are, yeah, reference and imaginative, make sure I'm not saying something stupid. These two are both, waterfall pieces, and right next to each other of referenced and imaginative. And this one, I can clearly tell how the perspective is working. It's making these nice straight lines. There's clearly a lot of depth going on here. Whereas when you start to get into the imaginative stuff, you start to look really far down at your stuff on the ground plane immediately. And then you don't really get a sense of necessarily the looking up at the stuff above it. It all just sort of kind of flattens out in the above stuff, and then you look way down on it on the bottom stuff. So I'd be careful about that and focus a little bit more on that perspective. So yeah, I do like how this one's working though. That one's getting very close to having some strong perspective. Honestly, just like 2 brush strokes that clarify the horizon line there, / the edge of the lake, and I think you'd have really strong perspective right here. That's about all it needs, which is why it needs that second pass so that you can go back in there and get a really nice crisp line to show the distant perspective where it meets the water. But overall, really nicely done. Again, bravo on doing it traditionally, and overall, quite good. The other reason I think I might do a second pass for you is I think you're getting a little too dark on your skies, and as most people seem to do. And I think you'd have an easier time getting brighter skies if you did it in 2 passes. One of the tricks of plein air painting for a lot of artists is they would actually paint those sky panels where they would paint the sky gradient before they even go out there and paint. And so then you can have this nice bright sky and don't have to worry about muddying up the rest of your values, and you can paint dark on top of it. So it just makes it a little bit easier. So really nice stuff. Drink some water here. All right, these look good. These are suffering from a bit too little contrast in a lot of places. You are way, way, way too scared of bright values. Your brightest value here looks like it is like a 50% gray. And because of that, well, yes, you could paint super muted stuff all the time. It is worth bringing in some brighter values. You're going to limit yourself to too small of a value range if you don't utilize a little bit more of that. You're getting some darks in places, but you're missing out on a little bit of the light. The other thing I would say is your silhouettes. Try to emphasize a little more the silhouettes without relying on almost line work, so to speak. Seems like you try to accentuate a lot of your edges with subtle lines and stuff. And I think there's certainly nothing wrong with doing that in a finished piece. I think the problem is it's an easy crutch to use at this phase that can keep you from benefiting from some of the lessons we're trying to learn here. But I think a lot of what you should probably work on is making sure that you do have that full value range of whatever values you want, whether they're really dark values, really light values, whatever. Because if you just take some of these and pop out some of the values, you're actually doing some really nice things. It's just not quite reading because we don't have that full value range that you can use. So I really like this thing, but if you just pop out that background, boom, suddenly it works better. So just some things to think about as you're moving forward with these. All right, looking good. I think you're another case of you are also banned from using texture brushes for a little while because you are painting a little too much texture-y soft stuff, and I want to see you make some super, super clear, crisp decisions. And it's hard to do that if your brush is doing cool things and you should be doing clear things. So rather than doing that, I'd rather see some ugly dark blobs here, but show us that you're making the right value choices, and also focusing more on the silhouette rather than the interior details. Like the interior details are here, sure, but if you did them in like 2 brush strokes, but you had a really obvious silhouette that you had definitely spent some time on, you'd have a much more obvious image that we could immediately read. So, a little less detail for you. And more time spent on the silhouette. So you can see this again is causing sort of wobbly silhouettes and not really obvious decisions on where exactly the silhouette is. And that carries on into when you're doing these, that you haven't quite made a decision, which ends up with this kind of like furry edge to things. And again, that's going to be kind of a nightmare once you start finishing these pieces, because you're not going to be quite sure where the edge is, what the silhouette looks like, what's happening there. So something to think about as you move forward with these. Right. Look nice. These are very nice. Yeah, you're looking good. You're certainly cheating a little bit because you have some gradients and stuff, but I'll let you cheat a little bit as long as you're making sure that your values work before you cheat. That's good. The referenced ones all look good. I don't know that I have too much to say about them. They look pretty solid. They all read quite well. I can tell what's going on. They have good senses of form, perspective, lighting. They're working really well. Now, once we get into the imagined ones, let's see here. It feels like you're missing out on some of the cool kind of compositional things that you're clearly observing here. Feels like they're lacking a bit here. So for instance, you've got kind of these barren landscapes here, whereas you've really paid attention to these interesting shapes here. So if you take this one and compare it with kind of the companion one here, you can see just as an abstract shape that these are more interesting. You know, if you take this stuff and flip it upside down and just look at it as shapes, this has some very interesting shapes. It has some interesting value arrangements. It has this nice dark, mid-tone, dark, light, dark thing, whereas this is sort of a gradient from dark to light. And it's missing out on some of the more bold shapes. You're kind of keeping things in, and you're not being as quite as adventurous with stuff. Same goes for like this scene. It's sort of the kind of typical landscape painter scene, and it's okay, but there's nothing really striking about it. Whereas you got something like this that's from reference, and you realize that this ground plane is super cool, and you've got these really nice values. And why can't you bring in some of that, of bringing in, say, some light values here, and let this be some sort of grassy thing here in front of maybe this dark shape that's really bold. And hey, we're going to have it go off the canvas to get some scale in there and make some really strong decisions here, rather than sort of going with the stereotypical thumbnail. Makes sense. So trying to bring in a little bit more of what you're studying up here into some of the stuff you're doing here, some of the stuff that makes this more interesting as you're going forward. So yeah. So I'm just checking the chat, make sure we're all good. All right, these are looking good. I really like the perspective here on the clouds. Yay, you have perspective in the sky. Amazing. So happy to see that. I'm really happy, especially since it's not even referenced. It's awesome. The rest of your imagined pieces actually have far less perspective, which is odd considering you have a really, really strong sense of perspective there. It's missing out on some of your other ones. It's less obvious that you're doing strong perspective things. For something like this, I might try to have a little bit more 3-point perspective. You're looking down really severely, and I think that would benefit you some there. Same goes for cases like this, where you've got this sort of distant perspective. I'd find some ways to show the perspective a little bit stronger, whether that's maybe down at the kind of valley floor here, and you can do it really subtly. But even a few shapes here that are showing some receding perspective lines almost, I think would help a lot. Same goes for something we kind of talked about earlier of adding in a couple of shadows almost that let you see that this is in perspective, these rocks. Whether that's adding a couple cracks in there where it's clearly wrapping around the form and we get a stronger sense of perspective. That's something I'd like to see, because overall these are quite successful. They're working fairly well, but a little bit stronger on that would be nice to see. Yeah, overall these are looking good. A little stronger on the perspective and brighter skies. You're a little too dark on the skies. Skies can be pushed a little bit. This is pretty much spot on with what you want to have. It's pretty nice to see, but I think the rest can maybe be a little bit muted. We're looking good. All right. Look cool. I really like the stylization you're getting here. It is super nice. You're breaking things down really well. You're breaking down the lights and darks. Sometimes you're getting a little too contrasty and you're losing the form because of that. So for instance, in this one, I think you could do with focusing a little bit more on the form and less on your shapes. I think you're getting a little too stylized and focused on making cool shapes and forgetting about some of the form here. I was losing the sense of how this mountain was actually constructed, partially because it was getting broken up here by these shapes. So there's some places I think you could bring your values a little tighter together to clarify things. Same goes for maybe this foreground hill, where I think the contrast between those light and darks are a little too high for that area. And it's causing me to throw off the form a bit. Even though it's interesting to look at, I think that contrast is just a bit too much. And whether that's bringing more light into your sort of shadow values or vice versa, you could go either way. But I think bringing those a little closer together so it's clearly one object would help a lot. Imagine stuff is looking good, pretty strong overall. A nice variety of shapes. Say, yeah. Overall, I don't have a lot to say right now. I think you're heading in the right direction. For the style you're kind of going for right now, it's kind of popular to have maybe a little bit stronger perspective in the foreground, a little bit stronger receding. It's kind of a dynamic thing to do. So maybe consider having that foreground tilted up a little bit more towards you rather than tilted down and looking further away. As in the ground is, you're going to see the ground a little bit closer to where, say, the viewer would be standing. But overall, quite nice. Very strong shapes. Nice flowing stuff. Looks good. Looks good overall. Yeah. All right. These look good. Yeah, overall quite good. You're missing out on some of the value range, as we've talked about before. A little stronger sense of some more darks in here would help your kind of whole painting to read better. If you establish some more darks in here, it helps everything else to kind of sit into place. Once you've got your darks and lights established, everything else will sort of sit where it's supposed to. It becomes a little bit more obvious as you're doing more and more of these. But overall, I like them. Just push your contrast a little bit more. And a little more sense of perspective, because again, I'm just going to always harp on that. Like these are, for instance, feeling a little bit too pasted on there as just shapes. So try to get in there and spend the extra time to focus on, say, where things meet. And that's about all it takes for something like a simple silhouette to turn into something that is a rounded, dimensional object. Just clarifying that silhouette ever so slightly is about all it takes. And then suddenly it turns from that into, oh, there's actually like a shape here that has form and is something. So try to remember that even as you're doing fairly blank things, that you can read these forms, a lot of it just from that silhouette. So when you're drawing mountains and rocks and whatever else, you can see a lot more of the form in the silhouette than you might think. All right, these look good. You're a little too contrasty, too broken up. I really like this one. This one it's a quite nice simplification of things. I like this interesting pattern of midtone and dark and midtones and lights, and it's reading quite well. When you get into your imaginative stuff, you get a little mushy with all your values. You're not making strong decisions anymore. For instance, you've got midtones and darks, 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 pretty much everywhere. And that goes for a lot of these. You keep putting super bright brights next to super darks, super bright, super dark, super bright, super dark, kind of all over the place. And it ends up in something of a jumble, which is why these aren't quite as strong as I think they could be. Whereas if you were to, bring these together into one shape with some modulation in them, bring this whole thing into one shape with some modulation in between it, and maybe, realize that that's a bit of a large shape to just have is all that dark. So maybe have like a patch of a light shape here. Again, has that very subtle modulation between it rather than breaking things up too much into this jagged stuff. I would also say that you are way too reliant on textury, chalky stuff, and it is definitely throwing you off. It is not helping at all. You're ending up with really sloppy edges where you need to have clarity. So for instance, the top of this mountain range, which is sort of the whole point of this piece, is kind of just, I can't quite tell where it is. I can't quite tell the forms. I can't read anything into it because you've just relied on these big chunky brushes and eraser tools and stuff like that. And it's not obvious where you're making that decision. Also, be careful when you're doing thumbnails that you're not doing the same thumbnail again and again, because you really like this L plus dot, L plus dot. So do watch out for that. If you find yourself doing the same sort of thumbnail again and again, watch out for that. You can tell when you're doing the studied stuff, you're doing huge variety of different stuff, and it's working well. But as soon as you get into your imagined stuff, you're falling back on the same stuff. Another thing is when you're doing these value studies, no textures, no fancy brushes, nothing like that. Try to do them with a very, very simple brush tool and nothing else, and rely more on that than on making pretty pictures. Pretty pictures do not matter for these studies. That's all about breaking down those values. All right, these are looking good. I think, I think it might just be that your values are good, but maybe it's your silhouettes are a little weak right now. Yeah, I think that's what it is, because your values are actually quite strong, but you've gotten a little mushy with your edges, which is why these images don't quite read as well as they should. If you go back in here and take like a few seconds to draw in these edges a little stronger without changing your values at all, this image is just going to read so much better. Already I can kind of tell what's happening better, and it makes more sense. And yeah, so I think for you, don't forget to really go back in and draw just enough to make things obvious what they are. Your values are actually are quite well observed. I like what you're doing with the values, but a little bit more attention to that final stage of, all right, I'm going to really clarify this stuff and make it make sense. Oh, I think I did something in Photoshop. Oh, I did the select thing. All right. And then I like your Imagine stuff. It's working pretty well. Again, you're maybe a little missing out on a bit of the contrast you could have, particularly, again, with the sky, because everyone seems to go too dark with their skies. So if you just punch them up just a little bit, just use that brighter value range. Don't be too afraid of it. I think you have a little bit of better time there. Oh, and yeah, to answer the question, it will be uploaded. It's actually at the same URL, so we'll be there, so anybody can watch it anytime. All right, I think we just have, this might be the last sheet even. So these are looking good. Yeah, these are actually working quite well. I think your sort of problem is you're looking at the shapes a little too small, a little too soon. And Also, the silhouettes are a little bit mushy. Not sure whether that might be the right resolution or using the wrong size brush or what exactly that is. I think that might be part of what you're running into here, and that you focus on slightly larger shapes. A bit better. Yeah, just a little bit of clarity, I think. Your edges are just so slightly too soft, which is causing it all to appear a bit half-hearted almost. Where you need a lot of clearly defined edges to make these studies work like they're supposed to. And when you start to get away from that, when you get yourself into trouble. Yeah. So a bit more confident with your edges and focusing on larger shapes. But overall, those are looking quite nice. When you're getting into these, it kind of, the stuff that was messing you up here sort of infects what you're trying to do here, in that there's nothing particularly wrong with what you're doing here. It's just that a lot of the same weaknesses are coming into play. So you have too many little local contrast here when you should kind of bring all this stuff together into a tighter value range. And same goes for this stuff. All of this stuff is a little too scattered. You end up with sort of a weak precision there. And too many small shapes when you should focus on those big shapes and making sure that they work well. So just a bit more clarity there and bringing those values together into big shapes. I will harp on about shapes for the next 12 weeks, so you better get used to it. It is what you have signed up for. So imagine if like all of this was part of the same value shape. And all of this stuff together. Maybe even brought that a little darker. Cool. Yeah, so more simplification. It's all about simplifying things. But overall, looking good. And I think that's all of them. We did it. Yay. Overall, very fantastic work, as expected. We went over those for a little longer than I anticipated doing, but that's okay. Maybe I had more to say than I thought I would. But hopefully that helped y'all. We will now get to do a short demo. So one of the things I really wanted to talk about while I'm closing out of all these images and stuff is there's different solutions to the same problem, as I mentioned before. There's not just one way to interpret a piece of reference into a good image. And so what I want to do today is I'm actually going to take a piece of reference, which I found here, and do a couple quick alternative value studies on it. One second. We're going to take this scene here and try to do different versions of it. Now, the problem with something like this, and this often comes up when you've got forest scenes. Forest scenes are a bit of a nightmare because forest scenes have all sorts of scattered values and they flatten out like crazy. Forests are very interesting to be in, but as soon as you start to paint one or even photograph it, you realize everything is flat. There is no form, there's no depth, there's no dimension, there's no lighting. It's all flat. The lights are too light in every photograph, and the darks are too dark in every photograph, and it's all just a nightmare. It's not good. And so one thing you'll find as you're doing studies of nature is that nature does not make good images. Nature is inherently interesting, sure, but it does not necessarily make a good image. It does not necessarily make a good composition. And what we're trying to do here when we take reference and interpret it into a value study is not just study the values that are there, but learn how to interpret the values that are there into what will become a successful image. So I'm gonna dive in here and start working on this and start figuring out how I'm gonna break it up. Something that I think will look kind of cool. I won't take too long on these studies because I know I've already kept you guys for an hour and a half, and I don't want to bore you out of your mind or anything. So the first thing you'll realize about painting something like a forest is that you have every detail that you could ever want all at once. There is a million details, and you don't want to paint a million details, particularly when you're at the thumbnail stage. You want to have a clear, readable thumbnail, because otherwise you're going to send it in to me, and I'm going to critique you for not having a clear, readable thumbnail. So you want to pick out the big shapes. And how do you pick out the big shapes? It's kind of up to you. That's the thing here, is that if I gave this same piece of reference to a bunch of different artists, they would have a bunch of different interpretations of this reference, which is kind of cool. I think it's a fascinating thing about landscape painting, and really all referenced painting, is that there's different ways to solve this. I'm going to show you my first solution here, which is just breaking it down and trying to make cool things. So I'm going to mostly focus my light values on the background, which is sort of the easy way to do this. So my emphasis of this piece is the fact that there is some depth here. I want to kind of show the depth of these different rock structures and this path going through this scene. That's my emphasis of why I'm painting this. And realizing what it is about a landscape, of why you're painting it, is absolutely crucial to doing a good value study of it. Because if you don't know why you're painting it, you're just painting it like a machine, and there's no decision making going on in that. If there's no decision making going on in it, it's basically like using a black and white filter on Photoshop and just turning everything into grayscale and like, yay, I'm done. But that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make decisions on, all right, well, I'm going to emphasize this contrast over this one. I'm going to make this more prevalent than I might otherwise. I'm going to tone down some contrast because I don't think it really fits what I'm trying to do. So for instance, even though this value over here is really bright behind this, maybe I don't really want to focus on that. Maybe I want the eye more drawn over here. So I can actually just tone down some of the contrast over here. I can add more of these, vines and roots and stuff like that, and tone down this whole contrast. Maybe, for instance, I really like this little light patch here, and I do want to focus on that because, hey, maybe I can silhouette a character there, or just have some nice dappled lighting there. Maybe I want to add multiple pieces of dappled lighting there, because you're kind of allowed to do this as you're making images. It's one of the mistakes I see so often from particularly beginners, but kind of everyone, is when they do studies, they become so wrapped up in making sure that the study they do looks exactly like their reference, that every little value and detail and everything like that is exactly like it is in the reference. They want to find perfect reference and then study it perfectly. And they don't ever try to make good images. And you can get yourself into a lot of trouble by doing that, because you're going to end up with frankly somewhat bland images a lot of the time, because you're not making those choices. And all of art making, especially once you get into doing the imaginative stuff, is making these choices. You don't have all that stuff spelled out for you. And so you need to have the confidence to be able to make choices about what's important about the image, what's not important about the image, and what you're going to do about it. One thing about forests is when you are in them, they have a ton of depth. It's fascinating just walking through a forest and seeing how much depth you get to observe. And as soon as you take a photograph of that, that disappears. It's gone. And the reason for that is a lot of our observation of a forest comes from the fact that we have depth perception helping us out there. And depth perception is helping us perceive the fact that there are all these layers of trees and brambles and bushes and rocks and everything in between us. It's helping us see all these different layers of things. Whereas when we take a photograph, everything flattens. It immediately flattens, which is part of the trouble of studying photographs too closely. Is if you just study the photograph, you end up with a fantastic study of a very flat scene. You miss out on the opportunity to get any sense of depth in there, using all the tricks that we've talked about so far and that we will talk about as we keep going, using atmospheric perspective, using different layers, using overlap, accentuating certain things, yada, yada, yada. So for instance, there's a little spot of light over here, and I don't really want that there. I kind of want this to be a solid shape. So I'm going to ignore that one. I think it's going to break up my shapes, and it's not really aiding to what I'm trying to do. And I do like this one here. I think that's a cool one, and I should keep that one. And there is no right or wrong answer here. The right or wrong answer is what you think looks good. This is where the art part of art comes in. If you ask me, like, should I do X or should I do Y? I'm not going to be able to tell you that, oh yeah, X is way better than Y. Because the better answer is the one that you want to do. It's the one that you think is the best solution to that problem. And so as somebody asked before what I think it is, what it's like to look at studies and stuff of this reference that I've shot, I find it fascinating because there's so many different solutions to the exact same piece of reference. And you might notice that some of you have done studies of the same reference, and you can actually see how one of your classmates takes that piece of reference and interprets it way differently than you did. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And you can see, like, what did they emphasize that I didn't? What do I think works better about the way I did it than they did it? All these different sort of things. Add a few darker values to make this one pop a bit. And I'm actually going to move on to another one to show sort of a different solution to the exact same problem. Let's go ahead and call this one actually done already. Obviously push it a little bit more, but for the most part, it kind of reads for what I want it to do and has some nice little layering effects in there. Let's take this exact same idea and paint it again. Now in this case, I don't care about the fact that there is a lot of brightness in the background. I don't really want that there. I don't care that there's, all this depth in the background. I really want to focus on the fact that there's all this nice light in the midground and the foreground. I like those little patches of dappled light, and I want to emphasize those, and I want to make those the most interesting part of this piece. Whereas the fact that it's in a forest, sure, that's cool. I'll make sure I've got some foresty stuff there, but it's less important to me. So what kind of different decisions am I going to make that pop out? Because all of a sudden now, the most important little patch of light in this piece is this one here in the foreground. This is what this piece is now all about. I've arbitrarily decided that I care so much about this foreground. This is what the piece is about. It's about this dappled light in the foreground and how it hits these rocks and makes these interesting pools of light. And in fact, I think they're so cool that maybe I'll add some more of them in there at some point. And I really like this kind of soft blue light, so I'm going to really focus on making this nice soft pool of light in the middle of the image. Of course, if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to ask. I'm not making myself painfully obvious. Please ask. Because if you're confused about something, it's probably because I wasn't very clear about it. I really like how all these rocks sort of have this dark base to them, and they all sort of fade to a little bit lighter towards the top. So it helps me get that sense of that really soft light that I'm seeing here on the leaves and what I want to try to get out of this piece. Are you suggesting that edge control as you decide on your focal point, or is value and perspective more important? It's all sort of important. Edge control is definitely important for establishing focal point, but so is value and perspective. They all sort of go hand in hand. There's no one fundamental that is king of them all. They all interplay with one another. Would you recommend these kinds of studies for us right now based on how the week one stuff went, doing multiple passes on the same reference? If you've got time, sure. I think they're certainly helpful. If you don't, if you're wondering, I would suggest kind of trying to keep up with the content as it goes. It's very easy to get behind in this course, and I'm going to do my best actually to give you some weeks where you get to do a little bit of catch up, but I would not rely on that. I would instead try to stay as current as possible with the assignments. You'll get a little bit more out of it because other people will be doing the same assignments, and you'll be able to kind of compare your work with other people and get a little bit more benefit that way. But if you have some spare time and are interested in trying some of these out, they can be pretty helpful. And looking at all the dappled light in this scene, that's what this piece is all about. So trying to pick out these cool areas of dappled light where you're getting all these nice little effects and stuff. And that's what this piece is about. It's about this nice dappled light. Another question, so how do you keep or invent that elusive depth in forest paintings or studies? It comes down to the stuff we've sort of been talking about on and off is atmospheric perspective. You can simulate sort of an exaggerated level of atmospheric perspective. A lot of it comes from layering of overlapping something on top of something else, overlapping another layer, and pushing things back that way. And there is even a little bit of linear perspective where you emphasize the things that show the fact that the landscape is receding, the fact that there is a perspective to the scene. So it is kind of a mix of all of those things. Even as far as once you get closer to finishing a piece, it can come down to the size of the details you're using, for instance. That can even be important. Question, I'm doing plein air paintings. Do you suggest doing a similar study when outside? Because I usually do colored tubes and composition mainly. I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Do you mean, do I suggest doing value studies? Sure, they can be very useful to do plein air, and it can be really handy to break things down when you're doing stuff outside. Because one thing about doing plein air stuff is people usually end up with a big muddy mess when they end up painting outside because they're just confronted with so many details. And I've talked about this in art camp before, and it is a challenge to do these plein air studies just because of that. Most people are just daunted the first time they go outside. And so learning how to break things down into very simple value shapes will help make sure that you do kind of stay on the right track and focus on making a clear image. Ending up with a bunch of mud on your canvas. Yeah, so what I'm really trying to emphasize is to focus on interpreting the reference and not just copying it. Copying it, to some degree is obviously helpful, but the more you can think while you're doing these things, the better. There's definitely a lot of decision making involved in making art. There is no right or wrong decision. There's just the ones that you make. And if you think it looks good, then it is the right decision. When we're doing value studies, we're not just turning on the black and white filter on our image. We're interpreting it to communicate exactly what we want to communicate, whatever the point of the image is for us. And that's part of the reason I don't really care as much about seeing, for instance, the reference for these studies, is it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to me what the reference looks like. It only comes down to how successful is your interpretation of that reference. Just because it maybe doesn't quite match the reference doesn't actually mean that it's a bad study. It just means that you made decisions that were different from what the image showed. And that's fine. In fact, it's probably a good thing, because images very rarely have perfect values in them that you want to copy 100% correctly. All right, I'm going to go too much further with this because I think I've gotten my point across here. Okay, so there's the two different versions of the exact same piece of reference. And I think both of them are fairly successful as thumbnails. They both read pretty well. They both make sense, but they're two radically different interpretations of the exact same piece of reference. Even despite my drawing changes in each of them, they are the same scene. They got the same shapes, and they're interpreting the same thing, but totally different takes on those things. And I think this is just an important thing to drill home, that even as you're doing these studies, you are making choices. You're not just turning your brain off and copying like a robot. Something I try to emphasize in art camp is that you should always be conscious and always thinking about stuff as you're painting. You don't want to get too much into mindless routine, because mindless practicing is not good practicing. You want to always be thinking about stuff and making choices about what you want and what you don't want in your images. So just some thoughts as we carry forward. Think about this stuff basically all the time. Even when you're doing any of the other studies, if there's something you don't like about the reference and you think looks bad, or you don't want to paint that part of the reference, you can make choices. You can change things. You can interpret things differently. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So yeah, good work this week. I think you guys did great. Proud of you as always, and excited for what you do next week with all of the master studies we're going to start doing. Obviously, one of my favorite exercises ever, and hopefully you'll get some out of it too. So thanks again. Thanks for hanging out, watching this, asking questions, all that. We will do this again next week. I will let you know about the exact time of that and how we're going to work that out. But yeah, so good luck with the master's studies, and let's all get back to work. All right, see you guys.